The scorching July sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Virginia roads as 35,000 Union soldiers trudged southward, their blue uniforms already stained with sweat and grime. General Irvin McDowell rode at the head of this massive column, his weathered face etched with determination and barely concealed anxiety. It was July 20th, 1861, and the fate of a divided nation hung in the balance as this untested army marched toward what many believed would be the war's decisive battle. Behind McDowell, the amateur soldiers of the Union Army sang patriotic songs and boasted of quick victory, their voices carrying across the Virginia countryside like a discordant chorus of American optimism. Most had enlisted for 90 days, convinced they would crush the rebellion and return home. As heroes before summer's end, they carried with them the hopes of President Abraham Lincoln, who had reluctantly approved this offensive. Despite knowing his Green troops were nowhere near ready for real combat, the political pressure had become unbearable. Northern newspapers, particularly Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, had been screaming onto Richmond for weeks, demanding immediate action against the Confederate capital. According to military historian James McPherson's comprehensive analysis in Battle Cry of Freedom, this public outcry forced Lincoln's hand, compelling him to order an attack before his army was properly trained or equipped for such an ambitious campaign. Confederate General Pierre-Gustave Dutont Beauregard had positioned his 22,000 troops behind Bull Run Creek near Manassas Junction, a critical railroad hub just 30 miles from Washington. The Creole general, hero of Fort Sumter, understood the strategic importance of this position perfectly. From here, his forces could threaten the Union capital while protecting the vital rail lines that connected Richmond to the Shenandoah Valley. As evening approached, McDowell's army made camp near Centreville, the soldiers building hundreds of small fires that dotted the landscape like fallen stars. Many wrote letters home, certain this would be their last night before glorious victory. Private William Thompson, of the 1st Massachusetts Infantry, scribbled to his wife, "We shall give the rebels such a thrashing tomorrow that they'll run all the way to Richmond. I expect to be dining in Jefferson Davis's mansion by week's end." The Confederate camps across Bull Run buzzed with different energy. These men knew they were defending their homeland, and many had already seen combat in smaller engagements across Virginia. Beauregard had spent days studying the terrain, positioning his artillery on Henry House Hill and Matthews Hill, natural strongpoints that commanded excellent fields of fire across the creek. General Joseph E. Johnston's 11,000 Confederate reinforcements were racing southward from the Shenandoah Valley aboard railroad cars, hoping to arrive before the battle commenced. The outcome would depend largely on timing and the untested courage of citizen soldiers who had never experienced the horrific reality of 19th century warfare. That night, as both armies settled into an uneasy sleep beneath the star-filled Virginia sky, few could imagine the carnage that awaited them at dawn. The pre-dawn darkness of July 21st, 1861, was shattered by the distant rumble of artillery as General McDowell's carefully orchestrated battle plan began to unfold. At 2:30 in the morning, Brigadier General Daniel Tyler's division moved toward the stone bridge over Bull Run Creek, their mission to create a thunderous diversion, while the main Union force executed a massive flanking maneuver to the north. Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding a brigade under Tyler, positioned his troops near the bridge as the first gray light of dawn crept across the Virginia landscape. The red-bearded colonel had served in the regular army for years, but like most officers present, he had never commanded troops in a major battle. His men lay in the tall grass, watching Confederate sentries move along the opposite bank like shadows in the morning mist. Miles to the north, the main Union attack force under Brigadier General David Hunter and Colonel Samuel Heintzelman began their arduous march toward Sudley Springs Ford. This flanking column, consisting of nearly 18,000 men, represented McDowell's master stroke. By crossing Bull Run far upstream from the main Confederate positions, they would sweep down from the north and roll up Beauregard's left flank like a carpet. The march proved more difficult than anticipated. The narrow country roads were choked with dust, and many units became separated in the pre-dawn darkness. Colonels shouted contradictory orders, while their amateur soldiers stumbled through unfamiliar terrain. Laden with heavy equipment they barely knew how to use, what should have been a swift movement became a grinding slog that consumed precious hours. Confederate Captain Edward Porter Alexander, positioned on Wilcoxon's Hill with his signal corps, was among the first to spot the massive Union flanking movement through his field glasses. He could see the glint of bayonets and the blue mass of uniforms moving through the distant woods. According to David Detzer's detailed account in Donnybrook, the Battle of Bull Run, Alexander immediately began sending flag signals to alert General Nathan Evans, whose small brigade guarded the Confederate left flank near the Stone Bridge. Evans, a hot-tempered South Carolinian known to his men as Shanks for his thin legs, received Alexander's warning just as Tyler's artillery began bombarding the Stone Bridge. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the battlefield like rolling thunder, and for a moment Evans was uncertain whether this was the main attack or merely a diversion. His decision in the next few minutes would determine the battle's opening phase. Realizing the true danger came from the north, Evans made a bold gamble. Leaving only a handful of men to hold the bridge, he marched the bulk of his force toward Matthews Hill to intercept the Union flanking column. It was a desperate move by a relatively junior officer, but it would prove crucial in giving Beauregard time to respond to McDowell's surprise maneuver. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature began its relentless rise toward what would become a sweltering 90-degree day. Both armies were about to learn that war was far different from the romantic notions that had inspired their enlistment. The real fighting was about to begin. By 9 o'clock on that sweltering July morning, the peaceful Virginia countryside erupted into the chaos of modern warfare as Union and Confederate forces collided on Matthews Hill. With shocking violence, Colonel Ambrose Burnside's Rhode Island Regiment, leading the Union flanking attack, emerged from Sudley Springs Ford to find Confederate General Nathan Evans's hastily positioned troops waiting for them on the high ground. The battle's opening volleys shattered the morning air like the crack of doom. Private Elisha Hunt Rhodes of the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry later wrote that the sound was unlike anything we had ever heard, a continuous roar that seemed to shake the very earth beneath our feet. Musket balls whistled through the air with deadly precision, while artillery shells exploded in brilliant flashes of fire and smoke, sending men tumbling like broken dolls. Evans's South Carolinians, though outnumbered 3-1, fought with desperate ferocity from their defensive positions. These men understood they were buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive, and they paid for every minute with blood. Colonel Francis Bartow's Georgians rushed to support Evans. Their distinctive gray uniforms soon stained crimson as Union artillery found its range. The Rhode Island Regiment advanced in perfect parade ground formation, their officers shouting commands while regimental bands played martial music. This was warfare as they had imagined it during their training camps back home. But reality struck with horrific force as Confederate grapeshot tore through their neat ranks, leaving gaps that revealed the true face of battle. Men who had been laughing and joking moments before lay screaming in the grass, calling for their mothers as life ebbed away. General Beauregard, awakened by the sound of heavy fighting to the north, quickly grasped that McDowell's main attack was falling on his weakest point. Racing to the sound of guns, the Confederate commander began feeding reinforcements toward Matthews Hill, including Colonel Wade Hampton's South Carolina Legion and portions of General Barnard B's brigade. According to Bruce Catton's masterful narrative in The Coming Fury, the fighting on Matthews Hill represented the first taste of large-scale combat for both armies, and the results were predictably chaotic. Units became intermingled. Officers lost control of their commands, and the carefully planned maneuvers of both sides dissolved into a confused melee of individual courage and terror. By 10:30, the superior Union numbers began to tell. Evans's battered Confederates, running low on ammunition and overwhelmed by the continuous pressure, began to fall back toward Henry House Hill, but they had accomplished their mission. The surprise element of McDowell's flanking attack had been blunted, and precious time had been gained for the Confederate Army to reorganize its defenses. As the gray-clad soldiers retreated in good order, they left behind the first battlefield of what many had hoped would be a brief conflict. The ground around Matthews Hill was littered with the debris of war, broken muskets, torn flags, abandoned knapsacks, and the still forms of young men who would never see another sunrise. The illusion of a short, glorious war was already beginning to crumble under the weight of reality. The Union forces paused to reorganize, their officers trying to restore order to ranks that had been scattered. By their first taste of combat, victory seemed within their grasp, but the day was far from over. The retreat from Matthews Hill had barely begun when General Barnard Elliott rallied his scattered South Carolinians and Alabamians on the reverse slope of Henry House Hill, their faces blackened with powder smoke and etched with the grim realization that this was no parade ground exercise. It was approaching 11 o'clock on that blazing July morning, and the fate of the Confederacy seemed to hang by the thinnest of threads. As blue-clad Union forces pressed their advance across the valley, standing prominently on the hill's crest, was the modest frame house of 85-year-old widow Judith Carter Henry, who had refused to abandon her home despite the approaching battle. The elderly woman lay bedridden inside, unaware that her property was about to become the focal point of the war's first major engagement. Her house would soon give its name to the hill that would determine the battle's outcome. General Thomas Jonathan Jackson had positioned his Virginia Brigade behind the military crest of Henry House Hill, his men lying prone in the tall grass, to avoid the Union artillery that was beginning to find the range. Jackson, a former mathematics professor at Virginia Military Institute, sat motionless on his horse, seemingly oblivious to the chaos swirling around him. His calm demeanor provided a stark contrast to the disorder that was consuming other Confederate units. As General B's bloodied troops stumbled up the hill in retreat, their officer spotted Jackson's unmoved Virginians and reportedly shouted the words that would create a legend. "Look, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." Whether B intended this as praise or criticism remains debated by historians, but the nickname Stonewall would follow Jackson for the rest of his brief, brilliant career. The Union artillery, commanded by Captains James Ricketts and Charles Griffin, had advanced daringly close to the Confederate positions, their guns positioned near the Henry House itself. These regular Army officers believed their superior training and equipment would quickly shatter the rebel resistance. Their batteries began a systematic bombardment of the Confederate positions, each shell exploding with devastating effect among the Southern troops. According to William C. Davis's comprehensive study, Battle at Bull Run, the fighting around Henry House Hill represented a crucial turning point in the engagement. The Union forces, despite their early success, were beginning to show signs of the confusion that would plague amateur armies throughout the war. Different regiments advanced without coordination, officers lost contact with their superiors, and the carefully planned assault began to dissolve into a series of unconnected attacks. Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman's brigade finally crossed at the unmanned Stone Bridge, adding fresh pressure to the Confederate right flank. Sherman, his red beard bristling with excitement, led his men forward with the confidence of a professional soldier. But even he was unprepared for the chaos that greeted his rival. On the main battlefield, where the fog of war had descended like a shroud over both armies, the temperature continued its relentless climb toward the mid-90s, and men on both sides began to suffer from heat exhaustion. Soldiers discarded equipment and clothing in their desperation to keep moving, while officers struggled to maintain unit cohesion in the face of conditions none had experienced before. The widow Henry, refusing all entreaties to leave her home, remained in her bed as artillery shells began striking dangerously close to her house. The old woman's stubborn courage would soon cost her dearly, but she had become an unwitting symbol of Southern determination to defend their homeland at any cost. By early afternoon, the scorching July sun had transformed the battlefield into a furnace of dust, smoke, and death. As the decisive phase of the battle commenced around Henry House Hill, General McDowell, confident that victory was within his grasp, ordered the final assault on the Confederate positions. Captain Charles Griffin's and Captain James Ricketts's artillery batteries rolled forward to point-blank range, their guns positioned mere yards from the rebel lines where they could deliver devastating fire. the Union artillery crews worked with professional precision, loading and firing their pieces in rapid succession. Each discharge sent deadly canister shots screaming into the Confederate ranks, cutting down men like wheat before a scythe. For a brief moment, it appeared that Southern resistance was about to collapse entirely. Confederate soldiers began to waver, some turning to flee down the back slope of Henry House Hill as panic threatened to spread through their ranks. But General Beauregard and General Johnston, who had arrived from the Shenandoah Valley just in time, rode among their troops with sabers drawn, rallying the wavering lines through sheer force of personality. Johnston, the senior Confederate commander, had turned over tactical control to Beauregard while he coordinated the arrival of fresh reinforcements. The sight of their commanders sharing the dangers of the front lines inspired the Confederate soldiers to hold their ground. The crucial moment came when Colonel Jeb Stuart's Virginia cavalry spotted what appeared to be Confederate reinforcements approaching Griffin's exposed artillery position. The regiment wore blue uniforms similar to Union forces, and in the chaos and smoke of battle, identification was nearly impossible. Griffin, uncertain whether the approaching troops were friends or enemies, hesitated to fire upon them. That fatal hesitation cost the Union Army dearly. The approaching regiment was Colonel Arthur Cummings's 33rd Virginia Infantry, and they were definitely not friendly. At point-blank range, the Virginians delivered a devastating volley that swept away the Union artillery crews like leaves in a hurricane. Captain Ricketts fell wounded, while Captain Griffin watched helplessly as his guns were overrun by Confederate infantry. According to James Robertson's detailed analysis, in Stonewall Jackson, the man, the soldier, the legend, this moment marked the beginning of the Union collapse. With their artillery silenced and Confederate reinforcements continuing to arrive by railroad from the Shenandoah Valley, the tide of battle shifted dramatically in favor of the South. General Jackson's brigade, which had been holding its position with iron discipline, finally received orders to advance. Stonewall Jackson stood in his stirrups and shouted to his Virginians, "Reserve your fire until they come within 50 yards, then fire and give them the bayonet. And when you charge, yell like furies." This was perhaps the first recorded use of what would become known as the rebel yell, a blood-curdling battle cry that would terrorize Union soldiers. For the next 4 years, the Confederate counterattack struck the disorganized Union forces with overwhelming fury. Fresh Southern troops, including Colonel Jubal Early's brigade, which had just arrived by train, slammed into the Union right flank with devastating effect. The amateur Northern soldiers, already exhausted by hours of fighting in the brutal heat, began to break under the relentless pressure. In the Henry House itself, the elderly widow Judith Carter Henry was struck by Union artillery fire and mortally wounded, becoming one of the battle's first civilian casualties. Her death would later become a symbol of the war's tragic impact on innocent civilians. Caught in the crossfire of national division, the Union Army's carefully planned offensive was rapidly dissolving into chaos as units became separated and officers lost control of their commands. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon of July 21, 1861, the Union Army's disciplined withdrawal had transformed into something far more dangerous and demoralizing. What had begun as tactical repositioning under pressure became a full-scale retreat. As word spread through the ranks that Confederate cavalry was threatening their line of retreat, the psychological effect was immediate and devastating, turning organized units into frightened crowds of men desperate to reach safety. The retreat began orderly enough, with Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman attempting to maintain discipline among his Ohio and New York regiments as they fell back from Henry House Hill. Sherman, his uniform torn and his red beard caked with dust and gunpowder, rode among his men shouting encouragement and trying to prevent the withdrawal from becoming a rout. But even his professional competence could not stem the tide of growing panic. The narrow road leading back to Centreville became choked with retreating soldiers, abandoned equipment, and the detritus of a defeated army. Artillery pieces were left behind when horses were shot or collapsed from exhaustion in the oppressive heat. Wounded men who could not keep pace with the retreat were left behind, their cries for help adding to the general atmosphere of desperation and fear. Confederate pursuit was initially limited and disorganized, as Beauregard's troops were nearly as exhausted as their opponents. The Southern soldiers had fought magnificently, but they too were amateur soldiers unaccustomed to the physical and mental demands of extended combat. Many Confederate units were scattered across the battlefield, their officers struggling to maintain unit cohesion in the aftermath of victory. The situation deteriorated rapidly when civilian spectators, who had traveled from Washington to watch the battle as if it were a sporting event, became entangled with the retreating army. These politicians, socialites, and newspaper reporters had arrived with picnic baskets and opera glasses, expecting to witness a quick Union victory followed by a triumphant march to Richmond. According to Russell F. Wegley's analysis in A Great Civil War, A Military and Political History, the presence of these civilians on the battlefield created additional chaos that compounded the Union Army's difficulties. Carriages and buggies clogged the roads, preventing military units from conducting an orderly withdrawal. Panic spread from the soldiers to the civilians and back again, creating a feedback loop of fear that transformed retreat into rout. At Cub Run Bridge, the situation reached its nadir when a Confederate artillery shell struck an abandoned wagon, blocking the narrow span and creating a massive traffic jam. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and equipment to flee across the countryside, while officers lost all control over their units. The proud Union Army that had marched south with such confidence was disintegrating before the eyes of horrified civilian witnesses. Congressman Alfred Ely of New York, who had come to observe the expected Union victory, found himself captured by Confederate forces and would spend the next several months in a Richmond prison. His fate symbolized the complete reversal of Northern expectations and the harsh reality that this would not be the short, glorious war that politicians and newspapers had promised. General McDowell, recognizing that his army was no longer capable of organized resistance, ordered a complete withdrawal to the defenses of Washington. The Union commander had lost control of the situation, and his primary concern now was preventing the complete destruction of his forces. The dream of ending the rebellion with one decisive battle had evaporated in the Virginia heat, replaced by the grim realization that the war was just beginning. As darkness fell over the battlefield on July 21, 1861, the magnitude of what had occurred began to settle upon both armies and the watching nation. The Union forces that had marched out from Washington with such confidence were streaming back into the capital as a demoralized mob, their defeat complete and humiliating. General McDowell's grand strategy lay in ruins, along with Northern hopes for a quick resolution to the rebellion. The casualty figures, while modest by the standards of later battles, shocked a nation unprepared for the realities of modern warfare. The Union Army suffered approximately 460 killed and wounded. With over 1,000 missing or captured, Confederate losses were lighter, with fewer than 400 casualties total, but both sides were stunned by the carnage they had witnessed and inflicted. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln spent a sleepless night in the War Department telegraph office, receiving fragmentary reports of the disaster unfolding in Virginia. The president, who had reluctantly approved McDowell's offensive under intense political pressure, now faced the grim reality that the rebellion would not collapse at the first serious blow. The war he had hoped to end quickly was instead expanding beyond all previous expectations. The Confederate victory sent shockwaves through Richmond and across the South, where church bells rang and crowds gathered in the streets to celebrate. President Jefferson Davis, who had arrived on the battlefield just as the fighting ended, proclaimed that Southern independence had been baptized in blood and proven on the field of honor. The Confederate Congress, meeting in Richmond, was emboldened to believe that European recognition and intervention might soon follow such a decisive military success. General Beauregard emerged as the South's first military hero. His tactical skill in shifting troops to meet McDowell's flanking attack, widely praised throughout the Confederacy. Thomas Stonewall Jackson, whose brigade had held firm at the critical moment, began his transformation from obscure professor to legendary commander. The battle had revealed natural military talent that would shape the war's subsequent Course. According to James McPherson's comprehensive analysis in Battle Cry of Freedom, the Civil War era, the First Battle of Bull Run fundamentally altered both sides' understanding of the conflict they had entered. The North realized that subduing the rebellion would require far more than 90-day volunteers and amateur generalship. The South learned that Union determination to preserve the nation was stronger than Confederate. Politicians had calculated. In the wake of defeat, Lincoln called for the enlistment of 500,000 three-year volunteers, signaling his recognition that the war would be long and costly. The president also replaced McDowell with General George McClellan, a young officer who promised to build a professional army capable of crushing the rebellion through superior organization and training. The battle's aftermath saw both sides preparing for a conflict that would consume the nation for more years and cost over 600,000 lives. The romantic notions of quick victory and glorious war had died on the fields around Bull Run, replaced by grim determination and the growing realization that American democracy faced its greatest test. The peaceful Virginia countryside that had witnessed such carnage would see more battles before the war ended, including a second engagement at Bull Run 1 year later. But July 21, 1861, would always be remembered as the day when America's illusions about civil war were shattered forever, and both North and South began to understand the true price of their irreconcilable differences. The brutal clash at Bull Run had indeed ended hopes of a short war, inaugurating instead the bloodiest conflict in American history.